The first rays of dawn painted the dusty streets of Millbrook Territory in shades of amber and gold, but Sarah Chen felt only the chill of approaching death. The wooden platform stood like a monument to finality in the town square, its freshly hewn planks still bleeding sap in the morning air. The rope swayed gently in the desert breeze, casting a hypnotic shadow that seemed to reach for her through the barred window of her cell. "Time to go, miss," Sheriff Hawkins said, his weathered face etched with reluctance. In his 30 years of law enforcement, he'd never had to escort a woman to the gallows, especially not one who claimed innocence with such unwavering conviction. Sarah's hands trembled as she smoothed down her simple blue dress, the same one she'd worn to church just 3 weeks ago, before her world had collapsed. Before Marcus Thornfield had been found dead in his study with her father's antique letter opener buried in his chest. Before the blood-stained handkerchief with her initials had been discovered in the victim's clenched fist. "I didn't kill him," she whispered, the words feeling hollow after countless repetitions. "Sheriff, you know me. You've known my family for years." Hawkins avoided her eyes as he opened the cell door. "The evidence was clear, Sarah. I'm sorry." The crowd had already gathered in the square, farmers abandoning their morning chores, shopkeepers closing their stores early, even children pressed against their mothers' skirts to witness what many considered justice. Sarah recognized most of the faces. Mrs. Patterson from the general store, who used to slip her extra candy as a child. Old Pete the blacksmith, who taught her to shoe horses. The Reverend Morrison, whose sermons on forgiveness seemed particularly hollow now. As she walked the dusty path from the jailhouse to the scaffold, Sarah's mind raced through the events that had led her here. Marcus Thornfield had been the wealthiest man in 3 territories, but his wealth came with a reputation for cruelty. When her father had borrowed money to save their failing farm, Thornfield had demanded impossible terms. The night he died, Sarah had gone to his estate to plead for more time, a decision that now appeared to seal her fate. The crowd parted as she approached the gallows, some faces showing pity, others cold satisfaction. The executioner, a thin man imported from the neighboring territory, tested the rope's strength with mechanical precision. Judge Aldrich stood ready with his pocket watch, his face stern beneath his black hat. "Sarah Chen," the judge announced, his voice carrying across the silent square. "You have been found guilty of the murder of Marcus Thornfield. Have you any last words?" Sarah's throat felt like sandpaper. She scanned the crowd one final time, searching for a friendly face, for someone who might believe in her innocence. The morning sun climbed higher, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air. "I am innocent," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, "and someday the truth will—" A commotion stirred at the edge of the crowd. Heads turned, murmurs rippled through the assembled townsfolk. A lone rider approached, his horse's hooves drumming against the packed earth. As he drew closer, Sarah could make out a tall figure in a worn leather coat, his dark hair catching the morning light. The rider dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with authority. Sarah had seen him before, the quiet rancher who lived on the old Mackenzie, spread about 20 miles south of town. He rarely came to Millbrook, and when he did, he kept to himself, conducting his business with few words and fewer smiles. Now he stood at the edge of the crowd, his pale green eyes fixed not on the spectacle of the gallows, but directly on her. For a moment that stretched like eternity, their gazes locked across the dusty square, and Sarah felt something shift in the air around them, a spark of possibility in what had seemed like her final moments. The stranger began to walk forward, each step deliberate and measured, cutting through the crowd like a ship through still water. Sheriff Hawkins frowned, one hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. "Sir, this is an official execution. I'll need you to—" "I know exactly what this is," the stranger said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the sheriff mid-sentence. He continued walking toward the scaffold, never taking his eyes off Sarah. Judge Aldrich checked his pocket watch impatiently. "Sir, if you have business with the court, it will have to wait until after—" "My business is with the court," the stranger interrupted, finally stopping at the base of the gallows. "And it cannot wait." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama beyond the scheduled execution. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared down at this unexpected presence, this disruption to what had seemed like an inevitable end. The stranger looked up at her, and in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: belief. Not in her guilt, but in something else entirely. Something that made her dare to hope for the first time in weeks. "Judge Aldrich!" the stranger called out, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "I invoke the territorial marriage law." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Judge Aldrich's face went pale, then flushed red with what appeared to be equal parts surprise and irritation. Even Sheriff Hawkins took a step back, his hand falling away from his gun. "The territorial marriage law?" Judge Aldrich sputtered. "Sir, that statute hasn't been invoked in over 15 years. The stranger, Sarah still didn't know his name, climbed the steps to the scaffold with the same measured confidence he'd shown walking through the crowd. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too much sorrow, the calluses on his hands that marked him as a man who worked his land personally. "Nevertheless, Your Honor, the law remains valid," he said, pulling a worn legal document from his coat pocket. "According to Territorial Statute 147, a condemned woman may be spared execution if a man of good standing agrees to marry her and take responsibility for her conduct." Sarah's mind reeled. She'd heard whispers of such laws in the older territories, remnants from times when women were considered property and marriage was seen as transferring ownership and responsibility. But she'd never imagined. "And you are?" Judge Aldrich demanded, snatching the document to examine it. "James Michael Colton," the stranger replied. "I own the Double C Ranch, 23 miles south of here. I've been a landowner in this territory for 8 years. I pay my taxes, and I've never been convicted of any crime." He paused, his eyes finding Sarah's. "I'm proposing marriage to Miss Chen." The crowd erupted in excited chatter. Mrs. Patterson fanned herself dramatically. Old Pete scratched his grizzled head in confusion. Children tugged at their mother's sleeves, asking questions no one seemed prepared to answer. Sarah stared at this man, James Colton, trying to understand why he would risk everything for a woman he didn't even know. His face was weathered but kind, his stance protective, despite the circumstances that should have made him wary of her. "This is highly irregular," Judge Aldrich protested, but Sarah could see him scanning the legal document with growing reluctance. "Miss Chen, do you consent to this proposal?" All eyes turned to her. The rope still swayed beside her head, a constant reminder of the alternative. But this wasn't just about escaping death. This was about binding her life to a complete stranger in a territory where marriage was for life and divorce was nearly impossible. She looked down at James Colton, studying his face for any sign of ulterior motive. Instead, she saw only steady determination and something that might have been gentleness. "Mr. Colton," she said, her voice hoarse but carrying clearly in the morning air, "you don't know me. You don't know if I'm guilty or innocent. Why would you do this?" For the first time since his arrival, James's composure seemed to crack slightly. His jaw tightened, and Sarah caught a flash of old pain in his eyes. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything to a lie," he said quietly, "and because no one should die alone when they don't have to." The simple honesty in his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Here was a man who had looked at her situation and seen not a murderer, but someone in need of help. Someone who deserved a chance. "I consent," she said, the words coming out stronger than she felt. Judge Aldrich looked ready to argue further, but Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward. "Judge, the law is the law, and frankly," he glanced around at the crowd, then lowered his voice. "There's been talk in town, people questioning the evidence. Maybe this is for the best. The judge's mouth pressed into a thin line. He clearly wanted to proceed with the execution, but the territorial law was explicit, and half the territory's legal experts were probably in the crowd. Any mistake here could cost him his position. "Very well," he said finally. "By the power vested in me by the territorial government, I hereby pronounce James Michael Colton and Sarah Chen husband and wife. Mr. Colton, you are now legally responsible for your wife's conduct and debts. Any future crimes she commits will be considered as much your responsibility as hers." "I understand," James said simply. "You may—" "Kiss your bride," Judge Aldrich added with obvious distaste. James climbed the last few steps to reach Sarah on the platform. The executioner stepped aside, looking confused about whether he should remove the noose or not. The crowd fell silent, watching this surreal wedding ceremony taking place in the shadow of death. James reached up and gently untied the rope from around Sarah's neck, his fingers brushing against her skin as he lifted it away. The simple touch sent an unexpected jolt through her. Not romantic, but human contact, after weeks of isolation and despair. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," he replied softly, so only she could hear. "We've got a lot to figure out." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently, a chaste gesture that somehow felt more intimate than anything Sarah had ever experienced. It was the touch of someone who was choosing to care about her welfare, someone who was voluntarily tying his fate to hers. As they turned to face the crowd as husband and wife, Sarah noticed the expressions around the square. Some faces showed approval, particularly among the women who seemed to appreciate the romantic drama. Others looked skeptical or disappointed, as if they'd been cheated out of their entertainment. But in the back of the crowd, partially hidden by the crowd, Sarah caught sight of a familiar face that made her blood run cold. Thomas Hartwell, Marcus Thornfield's business partner, the man who had been most vocal about her guilt, who had pushed hardest for her quick trial and execution, and he was not happy about this turn of events. James helped her down from the scaffold, his hand steady and warm on her arm. As they walked through the parting crowd toward his horse, Sarah realized that while she had escaped the noose, she was now walking into an entirely different kind of unknown. But for the first time in weeks, she wasn't walking into it alone. The ride to the Double C Ranch passed in relative silence, Sarah riding behind James on his sturdy bay mare. The rhythmic motion of the horse and the vast expanse of territory stretching before them felt like emerging from a suffocating room into open air. Behind them, Millbrook grew smaller until it was just a smudge of buildings against the horizon. "Are you warm enough?" James asked over his shoulder as they crested a hill. The morning sun was climbing higher, but the desert air still carried a chill. "Yes, thank you," Sarah replied, though she found herself grateful for the warmth of his body in front of her. Everything felt surreal. 12 hours ago, she'd been preparing to die, and now she was riding across open range as a married woman. When the ranch came into view, Sarah was surprised by what she saw. She'd expected something rough and temporary, like many of the homesteads scattered across the territory. Instead, the Double C was clearly an established operation. A solid ranch house with a wide porch, a well-maintained barn, corrals that housed several good horses, and fields that showed signs of careful cultivation. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. James glanced back at her, seeming pleased by her reaction. "My brother and I built it together. It's been 8 years of work." Sarah noticed he spoke of his brother in the past tense, but didn't press. The man had just saved her life. She could hardly demand his complete history within the first hour of knowing him. As they approached the house, an older Mexican woman emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her weathered face broke into a warm smile when she saw James, but her expression shifted to curiosity and concern when she noticed Sarah. "Senor James," she called in accented English, "you are back early from town." James dismounted and helped Sarah down, his hands respectful but steady at her waist. "Maria, I'd like you to meet my wife." Sarah. Sarah, this is Maria Gonzalez. She's been keeping this place running properly since I moved here." Maria's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but her expression quickly shifted to warmth. She approached Sarah with open arms. "Senora Sarah, welcome to Double C. But Senor James, you did not tell us you were getting married today." "It was unexpected," James said carefully. "Maria, Sarah's had a difficult time. I was hoping you might help her get settled while I tend to the evening chores." The older woman's instincts clearly told her there was more to this story, but she simply nodded. "Of course. Senora, you come with me. You look like you need food and rest." As Maria led her toward the house, Sarah heard James speaking quietly to a younger man who had emerged from the barn, probably a ranch hand. She caught fragments. Town needed to see justice done, and give her space. And no one else needs to know the details yet. The inside of the ranch house was as solid and well-maintained as the exterior. The main room featured a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture that showed use but not abuse, and windows that let in plenty of light. It felt like a home, not just a shelter. "Sit, sit," Maria insisted, guiding Sarah to a chair at the kitchen table. "You are too thin, and you look like you have not slept well." "When did you last eat?" Sarah tried to remember. The jail had provided minimal food, and her stomach had been too knotted with fear to accept much of it. "Yesterday morning, I think." Maria clucked disapprovingly and immediately began pulling ingredients from shelves and cabinets. As she worked, she chatted comfortably, asking gentle questions about Sarah's preferences and sharing stories about the ranch and the surrounding area. "Senor James is a good man," Maria said, as she stirred something fragrant on the stove. "Quiet, but good. He works too hard, thinks too much. Since his brother died, he has been too alone." "His brother died?" Sarah asked softly. 2 years ago. Miguel got sick with the fever. Senor James, he tried everything, brought doctors from 3 territories, stayed awake for weeks caring for him. But sometimes," Maria shrugged sadly, "sometimes God calls people home, no matter how much we love them." Sarah felt a pang of understanding. Loss had marked this man, just as it had marked her. Perhaps that was why he had seen something worth saving in her situation. The front door opened and James entered, his hat in his hands. He looked uncertain, like a man who wasn't sure of the rules in his own house anymore. "The horses are settled," he said, "and I sent word to the hands that we're not to be disturbed unless there's an emergency." Maria set a plate of food in front of Sarah, beef stew rich with vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and coffee that smelled like heaven. "Senor James, you eat too, and then you must talk with your wife about arrangements." James took a seat across from Sarah, accepting his own plate. "Maria's right. We need to discuss how this is going to work." Sarah looked up from her food, meeting his eyes. In the better light of the kitchen, she could see that they were the color of sage, and that the lines around them spoke of a man who smiled more often than she would have guessed from their brief acquaintance. "I want you to know," James continued, "that I don't expect, that is, you don't need to worry about." He paused, clearly struggling with how to address the intimate aspects of their sudden marriage. "You mean you're not expecting a real marriage?" Sarah said quietly. "I'm expecting an honest one," he corrected. "But I understand that you've been through hell, and the last thing you need is pressure from me. There's a spare room you can use, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." The simple kindness in his words made Sarah's throat tight. When was the last time someone had considered her comfort above their own convenience? "James," she said, using his name for the first time, "I need you to know that I didn't kill Marcus Thornfield." He studied her face for a long moment. "I believe you. How can you be so sure? You don't even know me." "Because guilty people don't maintain their innocence with such consistency when they're about to die. Because Sheriff Hawkins had doubts, and he's not a man who doubts easily. And because—" James hesitated, then continued, "because I knew Marcus Thornfield. If someone killed him, they probably had good reason to." This revelation surprised Sarah. "You knew him. He held the mortgage on our land for the first 3 years we were here, before I could buy him out." James's expression darkened. "He was not a kind man, Sarah, especially not to people who owed him money." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the afternoon air. James immediately tensed, rising from his chair and moving to the window. "3 riders," he said grimly. "Coming fast." Maria looked worried. Who would come so urgently? James was already reaching for the rifle mounted above the door. "I don't know, but given everything that's happened today, I'm not taking any chances." Sarah's heart began to race. Had someone come to challenge the legality of their marriage? To demand she be returned to face execution? She moved to the window and peered out, immediately recognizing the lead rider. "It's Thomas Hartwell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thornfield's business partner." James's grip tightened on his rifle. What would he want here? "Nothing good," Sarah replied, remembering the man's expression when the marriage had been announced. "James, he was the one who pushed hardest for my trial. He wanted me dead." "Well," James said grimly, checking that his rifle was loaded, "he's going to be disappointed." The 3 riders pulled up in front of the house, their horses snorting and stamping from the hard ride. Hartwell dismounted first, followed by 2 men Sarah didn't recognize, hard-looking types who wore their guns like they knew how to use them. James stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. "Afternoon, Hartwell. You're a long way from town." "Colton," Hartwell replied, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm here about your wife." "My wife is none of your concern. She's a murderer who escaped justice through a legal technicality. That makes her everyone's concern." Sarah stepped onto the porch beside James, ignoring his protective gesture to stay inside. "Mr. Hartwell, I told you before, I didn't kill Marcus Thornfield." Hartwell's face flushed red. "You were found with the murder weapon. Your handkerchief was in his hand." "Someone put it there," Sarah said firmly. "Someone who wanted me to hang for a crime I didn't commit." "Who would do such a thing?" Hartwell demanded. Sarah looked directly at him, her fear transforming into anger. "Someone who had access to Thornfield's house. Someone who knew about the money he owed my father. Someone who stood to gain from his death." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Hartwell's 2 companions shifted uncomfortably, hands moving closer to their weapons. "Are you accusing me?" Hartwell's voice was dangerously quiet. "I'm saying," Sarah replied, "that the real killer is still out there, and they're probably not very happy that I'm still alive to tell the truth." James stepped slightly forward, his presence a solid wall between Sarah and the 3 men. "I think you've said what you came to say, Hartwell. Time for you to leave." For a moment the tension stretched taut as a wire. Then Hartwell smiled, but it was the cold expression of a predator who hadn't given up on his prey. "This isn't over, Colton. Marriage or no marriage, the truth has a way of coming out, and when it does..." He swung back into his saddle. "Well, let's just say the territory has ways of dealing with people who harbor murderers." As the 3 men rode away, Sarah felt James's hand settle gently on her shoulder. "We need to find proof," she said quietly. "Real proof of who killed Thornfield." "We will," James replied, his voice steady with conviction. "But first, we need to make sure you're safe, because Hartwell isn't going to let this go." Looking out at the vast territory stretching before them, Sarah realized that marrying James had saved her from the noose, but it might have put them both in an even more dangerous situation. The real killer was still out there, and now they knew exactly where to find her. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't facing it alone. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Hartwell, and the Double C Ranch had settled into an uneasy routine. Sarah worked alongside Maria in the house and garden, learning to manage the domestic side of ranch life, while James and his hands worked the cattle and maintained the property. In the evenings, she and James would sit on the porch, talking about small things, the weather, the ranch, stories from their past lives. They were learning each other slowly, carefully, like two people feeling their way through a darkened room. "You're thinking too hard again," James observed one evening as they watched the sun set over the western hills. It had become his way of drawing her out when she grew quiet. Sarah smiled slightly. "I was thinking about my father. He would have liked you. Tell me about him." He was a dreamer," Sarah said, pulling her shawl closer against the cooling air. "Always believed that hard work and honest dealing would be enough to succeed. When the drought hit 3 years ago and killed half our crops, he should have sold the farm. Instead, he borrowed money from Thornfield, convinced he could make it work." "That's not foolish," James said. "That's hope. Hope that got him killed when he couldn't pay back the loan." James turned to look at her. "Your father died of fever, Sarah. You told me so yourself. After 3 months of worrying himself sick over the debt. After Thornfield started making threats about taking the farm, Sarah's voice grew bitter. After he started making other kinds of threats about me. This was the first time she'd mentioned this detail, and James's expression immediately darkened. "What kind of threats?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. But if they were going to build something real together, and she was beginning to hope they could, he deserved the truth. "Thornfield offered to forgive the debt if I agreed to certain arrangements. When I refused, he said he'd find other ways to collect what was owed." She looked directly at James. "That's why I went to his house the night he died. He'd sent word that he was foreclosing immediately unless I reconsidered his offer. I went to try to reason with him one more time." James's hands clenched into fists. "That bastard! I never made it inside. I was on his porch, working up the courage to knock, when I heard shouting from his study, then a crash like furniture falling over. I was scared. I thought maybe he was having some kind of fit, so I ran." "Did you see anyone else?" "A horse tied behind the house, in the shadows where the stable boy wouldn't normally put visitors' mounts, but it was too dark to make out much detail." This was new information, and James leaned forward intently. "Have you told anyone about this?" "I tried to tell Sheriff Hawkins, but by then they'd already found the murder weapon and my handkerchief. He said I was obviously lying to save myself." James stood up abruptly, pacing to the porch railing. "Sarah, that horse could be everything. If someone was hiding their presence at Thornfield's house, I've been thinking the same thing, but who would believe me now?" Before James could answer, the sound of a wagon approaching made them both look toward the main road. It was unusual for anyone to visit after sunset, and given their recent troubles, James automatically reached for the rifle he'd taken to keeping close at hand. But as the wagon drew closer, they could see it was being driven by a woman, an older lady in a dark dress and traveling bonnet. When she pulled up in front of the house, Sarah recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Thornfield," she breathed. The widow of the murdered man climbed down from her wagon with effort, clearly exhausted from what must have been a long journey from town. James and Sarah exchanged glances before moving down from the porch to meet her. "Mrs. Thornfield," James said carefully, "this is unexpected." Eleanor Thornfield was a woman in her 60s, thin and sharp-featured, with steel-grey hair and intelligent eyes. She looked directly at Sarah without flinching. "Miss Chen, or I suppose it's Mrs. Colton now, I owe you an apology." Sarah felt her heart skip. "Ma'am, I've come to tell you that I believe you're innocent of my husband's murder." The words hung in the evening air like a revelation. James stepped protectively closer to Sarah, but his expression showed the same shock she felt. "What changed your mind?" Sarah asked quietly. Mrs. Thornfield reached into her wagon and pulled out a leather satchel. "I've been going through Marcus's papers, settling his affairs, and I found some things that cast our recent troubles in a very different light." She opened the satchel and withdrew a stack of documents. "These are records of debts owed to Marcus, including your father's loan. But they show something interesting. Your father's debt was actually paid in full 2 weeks before Marcus was killed." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. "That's impossible. Papa never had that kind of money." "No, but Thomas Hartwell did." These receipts show that Hartwell paid off several of Marcus's outstanding loans just days before the murder, including yours. Mrs. Thornfield's expression was grim. The question is why? James took the documents, scanning them quickly. This changes everything. If your debt was paid, you had no motive to kill Thornfield. More than that, Mrs. Thornfield continued, I found a letter Marcus had written but never sent. A letter to the territorial marshal, accusing Thomas Hartwell of embezzling money from their joint business ventures. Marcus was planning to have him arrested. The pieces clicked into place in Sarah's mind with devastating clarity. So Hartwell killed him to prevent the accusation from coming forward. Then he framed me to deflect suspicion and get rid of a witness who might have seen him at the house. That's my belief, Mrs. Thornfield said. And I've brought these documents to Sheriff Hawkins. He's agreed to reopen the investigation. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. James's arm came around her waist, steady and supportive. After weeks of living under the shadow of false accusation, the truth was finally emerging. Why are you helping me? Sarah asked. I mean, I'm grateful, but Mrs. Thornfield's expression softened slightly. Because despite his many faults, Marcus did not deserve to die. And because no woman should hang for a crime she didn't commit, while the real killer walks free. She paused. And perhaps because I understand what it's like to be trapped by a man's expectations and threats. The implication was clear. Mrs. Thornfield had suffered under her husband's control, just as Sarah had been threatened by it. There's more, the older woman continued. Hartwell has been pressuring several of Marcus's other debtors since the murder, using the same tactics Marcus did. Young women, mostly, whose families owe money. With Marcus gone and me in mourning, he thought he could operate without oversight. James's expression had grown increasingly dark as she spoke. He's been continuing Thornfield's business practices. Worse, at least Marcus was careful to stay within the letter of the law, if not its spirit. Hartwell has been more direct in his threats. Sarah felt a surge of anger for the other women being terrorized. We have to stop him. Sheriff Hawkins is already moving to arrest him. These documents provide enough evidence to charge him with Marcus's murder, and hopefully the other women will come forward once they know it's safe. As Mrs. Thornfield prepared to leave, she turned back to Sarah with something that might have been a smile. For what it's worth, my dear, I think you've chosen well. Your husband has a good reputation in these parts. After the wagon disappeared into the darkness, Sarah and James stood together on their porch, the weight of the past weeks finally beginning to lift. It's over, Sarah said, hardly daring to believe it. The legal part is over, James agreed. But Sarah, I need you to know, even if this had never been resolved, even if you'd always been under suspicion, I wouldn't have regretted marrying you. She turned to look at him, seeing something new in his expression, something that went beyond kindness or duty. What are you saying? I'm saying that what started as a marriage of convenience has become something more, at least for me. His voice was quiet but steady. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with my wife. Sarah felt her heart race, but not with fear this time. With hope, and with the recognition of feelings she'd been trying not to acknowledge. James, she said softly, what if I told you the feeling was mutual? Instead of answering with words, he cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her, not the chaste kiss of their wedding day, but the real kiss of two people who had chosen each other freely, despite all the circumstances that had brought them together. When they broke apart, Sarah smiled, the first truly joyful expression she'd worn in months. So what happens now? She asked. Now we build a real marriage, James said. We work this ranch together, we face whatever comes next together, and we see what kind of life we can make. Together, Sarah repeated, liking the sound of it. As they stood holding each other on the porch of the Double C Ranch, Sarah realized that sometimes the worst moments of life could lead to the best ones. She'd been saved from hanging by a stranger's kindness, but she'd been saved from loneliness by something much rarer, a love built on truth, respect, and the choice to see the best in each other, even in the darkest circumstances. The nightmare was over. The real life was just beginning. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same town square where she'd once faced death, but now she was surrounded by celebrating townspeople. Sheriff Hawkins had just announced that Thomas Hartwell had been convicted of Marcus Thornfield's murder and sentenced to life in prison. 3 other women had come forward to testify about his threats and coercion, and their testimony had sealed his fate. James stood beside her, his arm around her waist, watching the crowd's reaction with satisfaction. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the community was healing from the suspicion and fear that had gripped it. "Ready to go home?" James asked quietly. Sarah smiled, looking around the square one more time. The scaffold had been dismantled weeks ago, and in its place stood a new gazebo where couples could be married and children could play. It was a much better use of the space. "Yes," she said, taking his hand. "Let's go home." As they rode back toward the Double C Ranch, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought them together. She'd been saved from hanging by a stranger who whispered, "Marry me," but she'd been saved from despair by the discovery that love could grow between 2 people who chose to trust each other with the truth. Sometimes the best love stories began in the most unlikely places, even in the shadow of a hangman's noose, with a whispered proposal that changed everything. Controls du Chat, Sonnet 4.